What is a farmer's legacy? They say it's written in the soil, in the straightness of the furrows he plows, and the richness of the harvest he reaps. It's supposed to be a story of struggle, yes, but also of triumph, a testament to a life spent in partnership with the earth. But what happens when that legacy, the very ground beneath your feet, is built not on honest work, but on a deafening 60-year-old silence? What happens when the story you thought was your own is actually the final chapter of someone else's ruin? For Arthur, a man of 58 whose face was as weathered and cracked as the dry Nebraska soil he was about to lose, this question was no longer a philosophical one. It was the cold, hard reality that was about to break him in two, right there in the oppressive quiet of the house his grandfather had built. The air inside was thick, not with the smell of baking bread or fresh-cut hay, but with the stagnant scent of surrender. Dust motes danced like tiny ghosts in the shafts of late afternoon sun slanting through the grimy windows, illuminating a world that was already a memory. This was the last day. Tomorrow the auctioneer's gavel would fall like a judge's sentence, and the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations would belong to someone else. Every object he touched was a betrayal. His hands, thick with calluses and scarred from a lifetime of mending fences and wrestling with machinery, trembled as he wrapped his late wife Martha's porcelain. Teacups in old newspaper. He could still hear her laughter in this kitchen, a sound that had been swallowed by the silence 5 years ago, right around the time the debts began to feel less like a burden and more like a tombstone. He was performing the grim ritual of clearing out his ancestral home, a final humiliating act of surrender to the bank, to the bad harvests, to a God he was no longer sure was listening. His daughter Sarah had called it a prison, this land. She had fled to the city years ago, unable to watch her father's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. To her it was weakness. To Arthur, it was all he had ever been, a farmer. And now he wasn't even that. He saved his father's old oak desk for last. It sat in the small study, a dark, hulking monument to a man Arthur had never truly understood. Thomas had been a man of few words and even fewer affections, a figure carved from the same hard, unyielding oak as the desk itself. He had taught Arthur how to work, how to endure, but never how to hope. Every harvest, every profit, every loss was met with the same stoic silence. Arthur had spent his entire life trying to earn a single nod of approval from that man, a flicker of pride in his father's eyes. He had secretly dreamed of making the farm flourish beyond anyone's imagination, of turning this patch of stubborn dirt into a paradise. But he had failed. He had failed as a farmer, failed as a husband who couldn't afford the best doctors for his wife, and failed as a father whose own child saw him as a relic. And now he was emptying the final remnants of the man whose impossible standards had shadowed his entire existence. The drawers were mostly empty, old receipts, dried-up pens, a tarnished silver dollar. He worked with a numb, mechanical efficiency, his mind blessedly blank. He was just a machine, clearing out the wreckage. In the bottom drawer, his fingers, rough as sandpaper, brushed against something that didn't feel right, a slight give. A wooden panel at the very back that was loose along one edge. Curiosity, a feeling he thought had long been extinguished, flickered faintly within him. He wedged his fingertips into the gap and pulled. The panel came away with a soft, splintering sound that was shockingly loud in the silent house. There in the dark hollow behind it lay a single, yellowed envelope. It was sealed with a circle of dark red wax, so old and brittle that a web of fine cracks radiated from its center. There was no name on it, no address. It was a secret, waiting in the dark for 60 years. His heart began to beat a little faster. He carried the envelope to the window, holding it up to the dying light. The paper felt as fragile as a dead leaf, and he was terrified it might crumble to dust in his hands. He broke the cracked seal with his thumbnail, the wax flaking away like dried blood. Inside there was a single folded sheet of paper. The ink, a faded sepia, formed a tight, controlled script, his father's. Handwriting, unmistakable and severe. It was a letter, but it was addressed to no one and to everyone. It was a confession. And as Arthur began to read, the floor of his world, the very foundation of his life, did not just crack. It disintegrated into dust. The words on the page were not just ink. They were a poison that seeped into his soul, rewriting every memory he had ever held. The letter spoke of a monstrous injustice, a sin buried so deep it had poisoned the very soil he had spent his life tilling. It told the story of the neighboring land, the vast, green, prosperous fields that now belonged to the wealthy Caldwell family. But 60 years ago, that land had belonged to a family named Martin. They had been his father's friends. The letter in his father's cold, precise hand laid it all out. Blackmail, threats, a fabricated crime that would have sent Samuel Martin to prison for years, leaving his family destitute. The Caldwells had offered his father, Thomas, a choice. Stay silent, and they would ensure his own small farm survived the coming drought. Speak up, and they would crush him alongside the Martins. His father, the stoic, hard-working man Arthur had tried so desperately to please, had chosen survival. He had chosen silence. He had watched his best friend and his family be driven off their land in the dead of night with nothing, and he had done nothing. Arthur collapsed into the old wooden chair by the desk, the letter trembling in his hand. The foreclosure notice on the table seemed to mock him, its bold black letters a cruel punchline to a joke he had never understood. His entire life, his struggle, the endless worry, the back-breaking labor, Martha's illness, Sarah's departure, all of it had been built upon a foundation of sin. His failures were not his own. They were the inevitable harvest of a seed of cowardice planted 2 generations ago. The Caldwells had built an empire on stolen ground, while his own family had been cursed to work a small, struggling plot of land, a permanent living reminder of his father's silent complicity. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was deafening, filled with the unspoken screams of the Martin family, with the weight of his father's shame. He was not just losing a farm, he was the heir to a legacy of theft and betrayal. And you, watching this right now, have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you discovered a truth so devastating it made you question everything you thought. You knew about your own family, about your own life. Have you ever had the ground crumble beneath you, revealing a dark secret that changes not only your past, but the very person you believe yourself to be? It's a lonely, terrifying place to be, where you are suddenly a stranger in your own story. If you've ever felt that chilling realization, that sense that the world is not what it seems, you understand the abyss that had just opened up at Arthur's feet. It is a moment that demands a choice. Do you fall into the darkness? Or do you find a way to climb out, even if it means destroying everything you have left? The symbol of his life, he now realized, was not the fertile soil he had always dreamed of. It was the dust, the fine grey dust that covered everything in this house, the dust of forgotten truths and buried guilt. It was the same dry, choking dust that the wind whipped up from his parched fields, a constant reminder of his failure. But now he saw it for what it was, the residue of a crime. It was the ashes of the Martin family's life, a thin layer of grime coating his own. The land itself felt tainted, sick with the memory of what had happened here. He could feel the injustice of it as a physical weight in the room, an invisible pressure that had been squeezing the life out of his family for 60 years, and he had never even known it was there. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning fire in his gut. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a feeling he thought had died with Martha. It was anger, a pure, righteous anger that burned away the fog of his grief and despair. He looked at the letter again, at his father's neat, damning script. This piece of brittle paper was more than a confession. It was a testament, it was proof, and it had come to him on the very last day, at the very last hour. Was it a final, cruel joke from the universe, or was it a chance to do what his father never had, a chance to speak? His gaze drifted past the foreclosure notice, through the dirty window pane. He could see the Caldwell property line, marked by a pristine white fence that stood in stark contrast to his own sagging, splintered one. Beyond it, the fields were lush and green, fed by an irrigation system that hummed with a power and efficiency he could only dream of. Richard Caldwell, the current patriarch of the dynasty, lived in a large brick house on the hill, a king surveying the kingdom his father had stolen. Caldwell was the one orchestrating the foreclosure, a vulture circling, waiting for the final piece of the valley to fall into his hands. He saw Arthur not as a neighbor, but as a stubborn weed to be pulled. For the first time, Arthur looked at that sprawling empire not with envy, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. He saw it for what it was, a monument to a lie. The name Martin, a name he had never heard before, echoed in his mind. They were ghosts here, their legacy erased, their story buried, right under his feet. He was standing on their stolen history. The letter in his hand felt impossibly heavy now, weighted with the fate of 2 families. To ignore it would be to become his father, to let the silence win, to carry this sin to his own grave. To act on it, to speak this truth aloud would mean certain ruin. Caldwell would destroy him. The town, which depended on the Caldwell's wealth, would turn on him. He would be a madman, a fool, a pariah. He stood up, his body aching, and walked to the window, the letter still clutched in his fist. He looked out at his own dying land, the cracked earth and withered stalks of his final crop. He had been fighting the wrong battle his entire life. He had been fighting the weather, the banks, himself. But the real enemy had been living just over the fence, smiling at him in town, offering false sympathies while waiting for him to finally break. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the valley, and in the encroaching darkness, a new, dangerous purpose began to form in Arthur's mind. The auction was tomorrow. His world was already over. But maybe, just maybe, someone else's could begin again. The question was no longer what he had to lose, but what he was willing to fight for. To truly understand the weight of that yellowed letter, to feel the ground disintegrate beneath Arthur's feet as he read it, you have to understand the ground he had been standing on his entire life. It was a foundation built not of love or encouragement, but of a quiet, unyielding pressure personified by his father, Thomas. Arthur's earliest memories were not of being held or praised, but of the rough, calloused texture of his father's hand, guiding his own small one on the handle of a shovel. The lessons were always practical, always silent. This is how you mend a fence. This is how you read the sky for rain. This is how you endure. Thomas moved through the world like a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight, his shoulders permanently stooped, his face a mask of grim determination. He never spoke of the past, never offered a word of comfort, and never, not once, looked at a bountiful harvest with anything resembling joy. It was simply a temporary reprieve from the failure that was always lurking just over the horizon. Arthur spent his boyhood and his young adulthood in a state of constant, desperate striving. He was a son trying to draw water from a stone, hoping for a single drop of approval. He saw the way other fathers laughed with their sons, the easy pride in their eyes. With Thomas there was only the silent judgment of his presence. Arthur would work until his muscles screamed and his hands bled, bringing in a crop that was slightly better than the last, and Thomas would simply nod, his gaze already fixed on the next task, the next potential disaster. This emotional barrenness seeped into the land itself. For Arthur, the farm was never a place of promise. It was a proving ground, a relentless test he could never quite pass. The dream that took root in his heart was a secret rebellion against this bleak inheritance. He dreamed of making the land so lush, so undeniably successful, that even his father would be forced to break his silence, forced to admit that his son had done well. That dream had a name, and her name was Martha. She arrived in his life like a sudden, miraculous spring rain after a decade of drought. She was a schoolteacher from the next town over, and she saw past the dirt under his fingernails and the quiet desperation in his eyes. She saw the dreamer inside the laborer. Martha's laughter was a sound the old farmhouse had never heard before, a melody that for a time seemed to chase the shadows from the corners. She planted a flower garden by the porch, a defiant splash of color against the endless brown and gray of the struggling fields. She believed in him with a fierce, unwavering certainty that baffled him. With Martha by his side, the dream felt possible. The weight of his father's silence seemed to lessen, and for a few precious years the farm felt less like a sentence and more like a home. They were a team, fighting the land together, and their love was the one crop that never failed. Then came the slow, creeping decay, the years when the sky seemed to forget how to cry. The droughts were not dramatic, apocalyptic events, but long, thirsty seasons that baked the soil into a cracked, useless crust. The debts began as a trickle, and slowly grew into a flood that threatened to drown them. It was during this time that Martha got sick. At first it was a persistent cough, a weariness that her bright spirit couldn't hide. The local doctor spoke of tests, of specialists in the city, of treatments with price tags that sounded like a cruel joke. Every dollar Arthur made went into the land, into seed that wouldn't sprout, and machinery that kept breaking down. Every dollar he didn't have was a testament to his failure to protect her. He sold a small parcel of land, then another. He took loans he knew he could never repay. He watched the light in his wife's eyes dim, and he knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, that he was losing her because he couldn't afford to save her. Her death left a silence in the house far more profound than his father's had ever been. It was an active, hungry silence, filled with the ghosts of laughter and unspoken regrets. And it was this silence that his daughter, Sarah, could not bear. She had watched her mother fade away, had watched her father pour his life into a patch of dirt that gave back nothing but heartache. To her, his perseverance was not noble. It was a form of madness. She saw the farm as a monster that had consumed her mother's life and was now devouring her father's soul. Their final argument was a storm of grief and misunderstanding, her words like hailstones against the weathered barn of his stubbornness. She called him a fool, trapped by the ghost of a man who had never even loved him. She begged him to sell, to leave, to start over. But for Arthur, leaving the farm would be like tearing out his own heart. It was all he was. So she left instead, fleeing to the city, to a life where things grew in predictable patterns, not at the mercy of a cruel and indifferent sky. The chasm that opened between them became his deepest, most private wound. The town of Blackwood Creek watched Arthur's slow decline with a kind of resigned pity. It was a small community, bound by generations of shared hardship and a quiet understanding of the pecking order, and at the very top of that order were the Caldwells. They weren't just farmers, they were an institution. The Caldwell Corporation owned the largest tracts of land, the grain elevator, and held the loans for half the families in the county. Richard Caldwell, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, was the town's unofficial king. He sponsored the high school football team and made generous donations to the church, acts of public benevolence that served as a velvet glove over an iron fist. Everyone knew you didn't cross the Caldwells. Their influence was as pervasive and invisible as the wind that swept across the plains. People were kind to Arthur in their way. They would nod to him at the general store or offer a quiet word of sympathy about the weather, but their eyes would always slide away. He was a walking reminder of what could happen when luck ran out. He was the cautionary tale whispered over coffee at the local diner. He was a ghost of the past, a relic of a time when a small family farm could survive. His neighbors, men he had known his whole life, kept their distance. They had their own struggles, their own debts to the Caldwell Bank. Getting too close to a failing man was a risk they couldn't afford to take. This isolation was a quiet, daily torment. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, adrift on his dying patch of land. The most painful part of this isolation was the constant, unavoidable comparison. His property line was marked by a sagging, splintered fence, a testament to years of deferred maintenance. On the other side of that fence lay the Caldwell lands. It was like looking at a different planet. Their fields were a vibrant, impossible green, fed by massive, humming irrigation systems that drew water from a river he had no access to. Their corn grew tall and straight, a perfect, uniform army of prosperity. His own fields were a patchwork of brown and pale yellow, the stalks stunted and withered. The contrast was a daily sermon on his own inadequacy. It was the physical manifestation of his life's story, his struggle next to their success, his failure next to their triumph. And you who are listening to this story, have you ever felt that? Have you ever looked at your own life and then looked at someone else's, and the gap between the two felt like an impassable canyon? It's a feeling that eats away at you. Quiet poison of envy and self-doubt. You start to believe that you are fundamentally lacking, that you were simply not born with the same strength, the same luck, the same worth as those who succeed where you fail. This was Arthur's world. He had accepted this narrative as truth. He believed he was a lesser man than his father and a lesser man than Richard Caldwell. He believed his failure was a personal defect, a weakness in his character that had cost him everything he ever loved. That is why the letter was not just a revelation, it was an earthquake that shattered the very bedrock of his identity. As he sat there in the dusty silence, the faded ink seemed to burn into his soul, rewriting every memory, every belief, every failure. His father's grim silence was not the stoicism of a strong, enduring man. It was the suffocating guilt of a coward. The bad harvests, the endless struggle, the farm's inability to thrive. Was it all just bad luck? Or was it the inevitable result of a curse, a poison planted in the soil 60 years ago? The Caldwell's prosperity was not the result of hard work or good fortune. It was the spoils of a crime, a legacy built on the ruins of another family's life. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of fighting the wrong enemy. He had been wrestling with the weather, with the banks, with the ghost of his father's impossible standards. But the real adversary, the true source of his family's long, slow ruin, had been living, just over the fence, smiling at him in town, offering condolences for his wife's death while actively plotting to take the very ground she was buried on. The dust that coated every surface in the house suddenly felt different. It was not just the dust of time and neglect. It was the dust of a buried truth, the ashes of a stolen legacy. The weight of this new knowledge was immense, a burden far heavier than any debt. It reframed his entire existence. His struggle was not a noble failure. It was a rigged game. His wife might still be alive if his land had been fertile, if his family hadn't been confined to this small, cursed plot, while the Caldwells flourished on stolen ground. His daughter might never have left, if the farm had been a place of hope instead of a tomb of quiet desperation. The injustice of it was a living thing, a coiled serpent in his gut, and its venom was a slow-burning, righteous anger that he had never felt before. He was no longer just a failed farmer mourning his losses. He was the sole inheritor of a terrible secret, the keeper of a story that had been silenced for 2 generations. The letter in his hand was a key, a weapon, a testament. It offered no comfort, no easy answers. It only offered a choice, a crossroads in the twilight of his life. He could burn the letter, let the secret die with him, and walk away from the farm with the last shreds of his quiet, broken dignity. Or he could stand up and speak the truth, a truth so explosive it would not only destroy the most powerful family in the county, but would also force him to confront the tainted legacy of the one man he had always desperately tried to please. The house was completely dark now, the last of the sun's light having bled from the sky. For 60 years this farm had been a place of silence, a place where the most important things were never said. The silence of a guilty father, the silence of a grieving husband, the silence of an estranged daughter. But as Arthur sat there, in the dark, clutching the brittle paper that had changed everything, he could feel a new sound rising within him. It was the sound of a voice that had been quiet for far too long. He had spent his life defined by the legacy his father had left him. But what if a man's true legacy is not what he inherits, but what he does with the truth once he finds it? The auction was in the morning, and the end of his world was at hand, but a storm was gathering on the horizon, one that had been 60 years in the making, and Arthur was beginning to realize that he was not the victim of the storm. He was the storm itself. The first grey light of dawn found Arthur not in his bed, but on the road, the old truck rattling like a box of bones. For the first time in years, a feeling other than grief or exhaustion propelled him, a cold, clear purpose. The letter was a map, and he was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. His first stop was the county records office in the nearby town of Garrison, a sad brick building that smelled of dust and forgotten history. He approached the counter, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. The clerk, a woman with a face set in a permanent state of weary indifference, barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as he asked for the property deeds and tax records for the valley, specifically from 60 years ago. She sighed, a sound of profound inconvenience, and disappeared into a back room. She returned 20 minutes later with a single, thin file. She dropped it on the counter with a dusty thud. It contained nothing of value. The land transfers were there, but the supporting documents, the specific contracts of sale for the Martin property, the very pages that would show the price and conditions were gone. A neat typed note clipped to the folder simply said, "Records damaged in 1968 basement flood." It was too clean, too convenient. A flood that had somehow only washed away the history of a single transaction. Arthur looked at the clerk, a question burning in his eyes, but she had already returned to her puzzle, her face a perfect, impenetrable wall. He walked out into the harsh morning light, the cold purpose in his gut now mingled with the first bitter taste of a carefully constructed lie. The silence wasn't just old, it was being actively maintained. His next stop was the town's nursing home, a place of quiet endings where the past was often more real than the present. He was looking for anyone who might remember the Martins. He found Jebediah Stone, a man of 93, his mind still sharp though his body was frail, sitting on a sun-drenched porch in a rocking chair. At the mention of the name Martin, a flicker of something long dormant lit up in Jebediah's clouded eyes. He remembered Samuel Martin. "A good man," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "A good friend to my father." They farmed side by side. Arthur leaned in, his hope a fragile spark. What happened to them? Jebediah's smile vanished. He looked past Arthur, out toward the distant fields. Hard times, he said, his voice suddenly flat. They just left. Packed up in the middle of the night. People said they ran from debts. But when Arthur mentioned the Caldwells, a shutter came down over Jebediah's face. The old man picked at a loose thread on his blanket, his gaze fixed on his lap. That was a long time ago, he muttered. Best to let the past lie. The fear, even after 60 years, was a living thing, a ghost that still haunted the halls of this quiet home. Arthur had found a memory, but he had also found the edge of the town's conspiracy of silence. Word travels fast in a place like Blackwood Creek, carried on the wind from one front porch to the next. The news of Arthur's questions, his poking around in the county records and the nursing home, reached Richard Caldwell before the sun had set that day. Caldwell was in his sprawling home office, a room of dark wood and polished leather that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a farmer's study. He stood before a large window that offered a panoramic view of his kingdom. The valley spread out below him like a map of his own success. He listened on the phone, his expression unreadable, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His power was in the quiet, precise application of pressure. When he hung up, he took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the small, insignificant blot of Arthur's farm. He saw it not as a neighbor's home, but as a loose thread in the perfect tapestry he had inherited, and he knew exactly how to pull it. The next morning the assault began. It was not with lawyers or threats, but with something far more fundamental: water. Arthur woke to a strange silence. The familiar gurgle of the irrigation channel that fed his small vegetable patch, the one last thing he was trying to keep alive, was gone. He walked out to the ditch, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. At the point where the channel diverted from the main Caldwell-owned aqueduct, it was blocked, not by a fallen branch or a buildup of silt. It was blocked by a dozen heavy sandbags, professionally placed and reinforced with rocks and mud. It was a deliberate, calculated act of strangulation. He spent the entire morning in the mud and scorching sun, his 58-year-old body screaming in protest, heaving the bags out of the ditch one by one. By the time the water began to trickle through again, his last crop was already wilting. It was a clear, brutal message. We control the water, the lifeblood of this valley. We can turn it off whenever we choose. As he stumbled back to the house, covered in mud and sweat, the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the weight that crushed his spirit. He collapsed at the kitchen table, the letter lying where he had left it. He picked it up, his hands shaking. For the first time, a venomous doubt began to seep into his mind. What if this was all a lie? What if his father, a man broken by the land, had written this as a fantasy, a way to excuse his own failures by blaming a more successful neighbor? What if he, Arthur, was just chasing a ghost, a pathetic man using a dead man's delusion to explain his own ruined life? The thought was a profound humiliation. He was not a crusader for justice. He was a fool, a grieving husband, and a failed father, tilting at windmills, while the real world, the world of debts and foreclosures, closed in to finish him off. The shame was a physical sickness churning in his gut, more painful than any blocked irrigation channel. The psychological warfare intensified. Caldwell's next move was silent, insidious, and devastatingly effective. Rumors began to snake through the town. He felt it first at the general store. The usual quiet nods of greeting were replaced with averted eyes and hurried exits. He caught snippets of conversation that stopped the moment he approached. Poor Arthur. The grief has finally cracked him. Blaming the Caldwells for a bad harvest, can you believe it? He's losing his mind. The pity was worse than scorn. It painted him as a madman, a figure of tragedy, whose words could be dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind. His righteous anger was being reframed as paranoia. His search for truth was being twisted into a pathetic cry for attention. The town wasn't just ignoring him, they were actively erasing his credibility, isolating him in a prison of their collective disbelief. He was no longer a neighbor, he was a problem. The rumors eventually found their way to the one person whose opinion could still break him, his daughter, Sarah. The phone call came late one evening, her voice strained with a weary, pained frustration. "Dad, I heard what's going on. I got a call from a friend back home. What are you doing?" He tried to explain, his words tumbling out, desperate to make her understand about the letter. about the Martins, about the truth, but he could hear the skepticism in her silence. "Dad, please listen to yourself. You're blaming a 60-year-old conspiracy for the foreclosure. You're picking a fight with the most powerful man in the county. It's not noble, it's self-destructive. Please, for my sake, just sign the papers. Let it go. Walk away with some dignity." Each word was a fresh wound. She didn't see a father fighting for justice. She saw a stubborn old man, embarrassing himself, clinging to a fantasy, destroying the last vestiges of their family's name. He hung up the phone, the silence in the house more profound than ever. He was now truly alone. And have you ever felt that particular kind of loneliness? The kind that comes not from being by yourself, but from being utterly disbelieved by the people you love. You hold a truth in your hands that feels as solid as a stone, a truth that explains everything, but when you try to show it to them, they see only a fistful of dust. They look at you not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity, as if you've lost your way. It is a terrifying, disorienting feeling to have your own reality denied by the ones who are supposed to be your anchors. It makes you question the very ground you stand on. It makes you wonder if you are, in fact, the one who is lost. This was the abyss that opened before Arthur. The world saw him as a madman, and the whispers were so loud he was beginning to believe them himself. Just when he thought the pressure could not get any worse, Richard Caldwell paid him a visit. The sleek black truck crunched up the gravel driveway, an alien craft in a landscape of rust and decay. Caldwell emerged, not in work boots, but in polished loafers, his clothes immaculate. He walked to the porch where Arthur stood, his smile a masterpiece of predatory benevolence. "Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as honey, "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see how you were holding up." He didn't wait for an answer. He surveyed the peeling paint on the house, the withered crops in the field. "It's a hard thing," he continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "watching a legacy crumble. I know you've been under a lot of strain. People are talking, saying you're not yourself." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then came the offer, the velvet glove sliding off the iron fist. "I want to help you, Arthur. My bank is foreclosing, but I can make this easier. I'll offer you a personal payment, $5,000 for the deed. Enough to get you a small apartment in town to end this struggle with some dignity." His eyes were cold, devoid of any real pity. It wasn't an offer. It was a final, humiliating command. Take this pittance and disappear. After Caldwell left, the dust from his truck settling back onto the dead earth, Arthur felt a profound and terrifying emptiness. The man's presence had sucked all the air from his world, leaving him in a vacuum of despair. $5,000, an insult wrapped in a threat. It was the price of his silence, the value Caldwell placed on a stolen legacy and a lifetime of struggle. He walked the fence line, his boots kicking up clouds of the dry, useless soil. He looked at his own sagging, splintered fence posts, held together with baling wire and stubbornness. Then he looked across the line to the perfect, pristine white fence of the Caldwell property, stretching to the horizon like a scar of white bone on the landscape. That fence was the story of the last 60 years. It was the physical border between a lie that had flourished and a truth that had withered and died. And he was standing on the wrong side of it. The weight of it all, the town's scorn, his daughter's disbelief, Caldwell's suffocating power, and his own gnawing self-doubt, finally broke him. He was a fool, a tired, broken old man who had mistaken a ghost story for a battle cry. He walked back into the house, into the dark study where this nightmare had begun. The letter was on the desk, its yellowed paper seeming to mock him. It was not a weapon. It was a curse. It had brought him nothing but more pain, more humiliation. He picked it up, his decision made. He would end it. He would burn the letter and with it the ghost of Samuel Martin and the sin of his own father. He would take Caldwell's insulting offer and vanish. He would finally be free of this land. He crossed the room to the old cast-iron stove, the only source of heat in the house. He knelt before it, his movements slow and deliberate like a man preparing his own grave. He opened the small metal door, the embers inside glowing a dull, angry red. The heat washed over his face. This was it, the end of the story. He held the brittle paper over the opening, his knuckles white. The firelight danced on his weathered face, illuminating the tracks of tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. He could let it go. He could drop this piece of paper and let 60 years of injustice turn to ash and smoke. He could choose silence, just as his father had. His fingers loosened, the edge of the paper dipping down, curling from the heat, a wisp of smoke rising to meet it. The world held its breath, waiting for the past to be consumed. The heat from the open stove door washed over Arthur's face, a dry, scorching breath that felt like the prelude to hell. He was on his knees, a penitent before a fiery altar, the yellowed letter held in his trembling hand. This was it, the final act of surrender. He would burn this curse, this inheritance of shame, and let the truth turn to ash and smoke, indistinguishable from the 60 years of dust that had settled on his life. He would become his father, choosing silence, choosing the empty peace of oblivion. His fingers loosened, the edge of the paper dipping toward the glowing embers. It began to curl, to blacken at the very tip, a wisp of smoke rising like a departing soul. He was a breath away from letting it go, from letting the story die forever. But in that instant, a scent, faint and long forgotten, caught in the rising heat. The smell of dried lavender and cinnamon, the scent of his mother's hope chest. It was a ghost on the air, a memory so powerful it was like a hand on his shoulder pulling him back from the edge. He flinched, pulling the letter back from the fire as if he'd been burned. The memory of his mother, a woman whose quiet strength had been the only buffer against his. Father's grim silence flooded him. He had been so consumed by his father's legacy, his father's sin, that he had almost forgotten hers. Her legacy was not one of secrets, but of small, stubborn acts of beauty. The flower garden that defied the drought, the carefully stitched quilts, the box of keepsakes she had guarded her whole life. He stood up, his knees cracking in protest, and left the letter on the cold kitchen table. He was no longer looking for an escape. He was looking for a reason. He needed to touch something that was true, something that hadn't been poisoned by the lie. He needed a piece of his mother. He made his way to the small, dark closet under the stairs, a place he hadn't opened in years, the air inside thick with the undisturbed dust of a lifetime. There in the back, behind a stack of old blankets that had long since surrendered to moths, was her cedar chest. The wood was dark and smooth, and the scent that had wafted from the stove was 100 times stronger. Here, a concentrated perfume of a life lived with grace in a house devoid of it. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, it was a time capsule, her wedding dress, yellowed to the color of old cream, bundles of his childhood drawings, tied with faded ribbon, and beneath it all, a heavy, leather-bound photo album. He carried it to the window, into the last of the afternoon's weak light, and sat down on the dusty floor. He turned the thick, black pages, the protective tissue paper crinkling like old leaves. There were pictures of him as a baby, of his grandparents, of community picnics and holiday gatherings. It was a catalogue of a life he barely recognized, a life with moments of simple, unburdened joy. He was about to close the album, the ache in his chest more profound than ever, when a loose photograph slipped from between the final pages and fluttered to the floor. He picked it up. The image was sepia-toned, the edges scalloped. It showed two young men, not much older than 20, standing in front of a Ferris wheel at a county fair. They were grinning, their faces bright with the easy confidence of youth, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in a way that spoke of a deep and effortless friendship. One of them was his father, Thomas, but a version of his father he had never known, a man with laughter in his eyes, a man unburdened by the weight he would later carry. Arthur stared at the other man's face, a friendly, open face with a kind smile. He turned the photograph over. There, in his mother's elegant looping script, were 2 lines of faded blue ink. Thomas and his best friend, Samuel Martin. The first line read, and underneath, a second line, added with a different pen, perhaps years later, a single, heartbreaking sentence. Before everything changed. The name, Samuel Martin, was no longer a ghost from a dead man's confession. It was the face of his father's best friend. It was the face of the man his father had betrayed. The photograph was not just proof, it was a judgment. It was a testament to what had been lost, what had been sacrificed for a plot of cursed land. The doubt that had been poisoning him, the whispers that he was a madman chasing shadows, were incinerated in a sudden, clarifying blaze of certainty. He was not crazy. The letter was not a fantasy. The injustice was real, and it had a name and a face. He looked from the smiling man in the photograph to the letter on the kitchen table. The anger that had been a slow burn in his gut now sharpened into a cold, hard point of purpose. He was no longer just a son grappling with his father's shame. He was the last witness to a crime, and this photograph was his sworn testimony. He walked back to the kitchen, his steps now firm, decisive. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the scene of a crime, and he was the one investigator who refused to let the case go cold. He knew the town was a dead end. The silence there was a wall he could not break alone. He needed to find the descendants of Samuel Martin. He needed to find them wherever they were. He went to his father's desk, the very piece of furniture that had yielded the secret, and pulled out the old, dust-covered checkbook. There wasn't much left, a few $100s. Money he had been saving for the moving truck he now knew he wouldn't need. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened the ancient laptop Sarah had bought him years ago, and with clumsy, determined fingers, he searched for an online investigator, someone who could find a ghost with nothing more than a name from a 60-year-old photograph. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, the last of his money cast into the digital ether on a thread of hope. It was the biggest bet of his life. The next 24 hours were the longest of his existence. The auction was the following morning. The clock was a torturer, each tick a countdown to his final annihilation. He didn't sleep. He paced the worn floorboards of the farmhouse, the photograph in his shirt pocket, a talisman against the encroaching despair. He felt the weight of 60 years of silence pressing in on him, the ghosts of two families watching him, waiting. Just as the sun began to cast its first pale grey light across his withered fields, a notification pinged on the laptop. His heart hammered against his ribs. He opened the email. It was from the investigator. The report was short, concise. The search had been difficult, the trail cold for decades, but they had found her, Ilara Martin, granddaughter of Samuel Martin, and then came the line that made the air freeze in Arthur's lungs. Occupation, public defense attorney, Chicago, Illinois. A lawyer, a defender of the lost causes. It was too perfect, too improbable to be a coincidence. It felt like a sign, a whisper from the universe that he was on the right path. His hand trembled so violently, he could barely dial the number provided in the report. It was early, barely dawn in Chicago, but he couldn't wait. The phone rang 4 times, each ring an eternity, before a woman's voice, sharp and alert despite the hour, answered. Ilara Martin. He cleared his throat, his own voice a stranger's croak. My name is Arthur Jensen, he began. I live in Blackwood Creek, Nebraska. I believe our grandfathers knew each other. There was a long, skeptical pause on the other end of the line. He could picture her, a busy city lawyer, already dismissing him as a crank, a rambling old man. Sir, I'm not sure I understand, she said, her tone polite but guarded. He knew he had one chance. He took a deep breath, picked up his father's letter, and read a single damning line from it. He told me to stay silent, to watch my friend be ruined, and in return, Caldwell would see that my own farm survived the coming drought. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of disbelief, but of a profound, world-altering shock. He could hear her faint, sharp intake of breath, a sound that traveled 1,000 miles and 60 years to meet him in his dusty kitchen. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, stripped of its professional armor, raw with a history she had only ever known through fragmented stories. My grandmother, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She used to talk about a great betrayal. She said my grandfather lost his land, his spirit, everything, because a friend he trusted chose silence. For the first time since he had opened that cursed envelope, Arthur was not alone. The weight on his shoulders did not vanish, but for the first time he felt he was not carrying it by himself. A connection, fragile but real, had been forged across the decades, a bridge of shared truth built between a broken farmer and a tenacious lawyer. And what about you? If you were standing in Arthur's shoes, having been beaten down, isolated and disbelieved by everyone you knew, would you have had the courage to make that one last call? To risk your final shred of dignity on the hope that a stranger, a voice on the other end of a telephone line, would believe you when no one else would? It's in these moments when we are at our most broken that we face the truest test of our character. Do we surrender to the silence, or do we use our last breath to speak our truth, even if we fear no one is listening? Arthur had made his choice, and in doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. Hope, an emotion he thought had been buried with his wife, ignited in his chest a fierce and fragile flame. Ilara didn't hesitate. "The foreclosure auction is tomorrow?" she asked, her voice now filled with a lawyer's focused intensity. "Yes," Arthur said. "At 10 in the morning." There was another pause, but this time it was filled with calculation, with the sound of a mind racing, a warrior planning her attack. "Don't say another word to anyone," she commanded. "Don't sign anything. I'm on the first flight out of O'Hare. I'll be there." He hung up the phone, the silence of the house returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of despair, but the quiet before a storm. He walked to the window and looked out at the fence line, the border between his world and Caldwell's. The sagging, splintered wood of his own fence no longer looked like a symbol of his failure. It looked like the front line of a battle that was about to begin. The sun was climbing higher, illuminating the dust motes still dancing in the air. Tomorrow was the auction. Tomorrow was the end. But for the first time, Arthur realized the end of his story might just be the beginning of justice for someone else's. The dawn was breaking, not just on his final day at the farm, but on a reckoning 60 years in the making. The morning of the auction broke not with a sunrise, but with a concession. The sky was a bruised uniform grey, and a cold, restless wind swept across the plains, kicking up plumes of the very dust that had come to define Arthur's life. It was a day for endings, a day for burying things. The town of Blackwood Creek had gathered on the barren patch of land in front of Arthur's farmhouse, their trucks and cars parked in a ragged line along the dirt road. They were a silent, somber congregation, their faces etched with a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and a grim understanding that this was the natural order of things. The weak fell, and the strong consumed. Richard Caldwell was not among the crowd. He stood apart, near the auctioneer's makeshift podium, a king surveying the final acquisition of his territory. He wore a tailored tweed jacket, looking more like a country squire than a farmer, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence. He nodded to a few of the more prominent townsfolk, his smile a brief, dismissive flash of white. He was not here to gloat, not openly. He was here to perform a necessary and ultimately profitable piece of business. The air was thick with the unspoken history of the valley, with the quiet acceptance of power. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a face made for false sympathy, cleared his throat and began his preamble. His words about legacy and inheritance a cruel, unintentional irony. Just as the auctioneer was about to open the bidding on the first piece of rusted farm equipment, a sound cut through the wind. It was the slow, determined crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Every head turned. A sleek, dark sedan, its paint a stark urban black against the muted landscape, rolled to a stop. It was a vehicle that did not belong here, a visitor from another world. The driver's side door opened, and a young woman emerged. She was dressed in a simple, dark suit, her movements sharp and efficient. This was Elara Martin. She scanned the crowd, her gaze missing nothing, her expression a mask of calm, professional focus. Then, the passenger door opened, and Arthur Jensen stepped out into the wind. A collective soft gasp rippled through the crowd. This was not the man they had been whispering about for the past week. He was not the broken, rambling figure of their pitying gossip. He was still a man of 58, his face a roadmap of hardship, his clothes worn and simple, but the stoop in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a straightness in his spine they had never seen before. The hollowed-out look in his eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady light, a flame of purpose that seemed to burn against the grey day. He did not look at his neighbours. He did not look at the auctioneer. His eyes found Richard Caldwell and held him in a gaze that was neither pleading nor hateful, but was as steady and unyielding as the horizon itself. Together, he and Elara walked through the parted crowd, a silent sea of confused and curious faces. They didn't stop until they were standing directly in front of the auctioneer's podium, creating a triangle of tension. Between them, the auctioneer and Richard Caldwell. The auctioneer faltered, his practiced speech dying on his lips. He looked to Caldwell for a cue, his face a comic mask of bewilderment. Caldwell's benevolent smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, thin line. A flicker of annoyance of a carefully laid plan being disrupted crossed his features. "Arthur," he said, his voice low but carrying on the wind, "this isn't the time or the place for a scene. Let these good people get on with their day." Arthur did not answer him directly. He turned for the first time to face the crowd, to face the people who had known him his entire life, the people who had watched him struggle, who had pitied him, and who had ultimately turned their backs on him. He held up his hand, and in it was a single yellowed piece of paper, so fragile it seemed the wind might tear it from his grasp. The crowd leaned in, a single silent body, straining to hear. "My name is Arthur Jensen," he began, his voice not loud, but clear and steady, cutting through the wind's mournful sigh. "This is my home, or at least I thought it was." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembled community. "For 60 years," he continued, "my family has worked this land. We have fought drought and debt. We buried my mother here. We buried my wife here. I have poured my life, my sweat, and my sorrow into this soil, and I have failed. You all know that. You've seen it. You've whispered about it. I have been a failure." His words were a raw public confession, and a wave of uneasy shuffling moved through the crowd. They had expected anger, perhaps madness. They had not expected this stark, painful honesty. He was not accusing them. He was indicting himself, and in doing so he was commanding their absolute attention. "But I learned something this week," he said, his voice gaining a new strength, a new resonance. "I learned that my failure was not my own. It was an inheritance." He held the letter higher. "This is my father's handwriting. It is a confession. It tells the story of how 60 years ago the farm next to ours, a farm far richer and more promising than this one, was stolen. It was stolen from a family named Martin. It was stolen through blackmail and lies by the Caldwell family. The name Martin hung in the air, a ghost suddenly given substance. A few of the oldest residents shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the ground, a flicker of a buried memory in their expressions. He told them everything. He told them of his father's choice, to remain silent and survive, or to speak up and be crushed alongside his best friend. He spoke of the poison of that silence, a poison that had seeped into the soil, that had cursed his family to a lifetime of struggle on this small, barren plot of land, while an empire was built next door on a foundation of theft. He spoke not with rage, but with a profound, bone-deep sorrow, the sorrow of a son who had finally understood the true weight his father had carried, the weight of a guilty conscience. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single, rapt entity, bound by the power of a truth that had been buried for too long. Richard Caldwell's face had become a mask of cold fury. His carefully constructed world, his image as the town's benevolent patriarch, was being dismantled, word by painful word, by a man he had dismissed as a broken relic. He signaled to his lawyer, a man in a sharp city suit who looked deeply uncomfortable standing in the dirt, and the lawyer began to push his way through the crowd. "This is slander," the lawyer began to shout. "This is a desperate act by a desperate man." But his voice was drowned out by the force of Arthur's story. No one was listening to the lawyer. They were listening to the truth. Seeing his lawyer was ineffective, Caldwell made his final move. He strode forward, closing the distance between himself and Arthur until they were only a few feet apart. He ignored Ilara completely, his focus entirely on the man who was threatening to undo everything. He did not shout. His voice was a low, venomous hiss, a sound meant for Arthur, but audible to the first few rows of the silent crowd. "Stop this, Arthur. Stop this fantasy right now." He let the words sink in, his eyes boring into Arthur's. "Walk away and I will tear up your debt. You keep your farm, your family's home." The offer was a thunderclap in the charged silence, a way out, an escape from the ruin that was just moments away. Then came the threat, the steel beneath the velvet. "Say one more word," Caldwell whispered, "and I will destroy you. I will use every dollar I have to bury you and this young woman in litigation. You will lose this farm, and you will have nothing left but the dirt under your fingernails and the shame of what you've done here today." It was the ultimate temptation, the ultimate test. It was the same choice his father had been given 60 years ago, presented in a different form. Silence and you survive. Speak and you are annihilated. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down, and the only sound was the frantic beating of Arthur's own heart. And you, watching this right now, what would you do? Placed in that impossible position, with the home of your ancestors, the ground where your loved ones are buried, hanging in the balance. Would you take the deal? Would you choose the quiet comfort of survival, letting an old injustice remain buried? Or would you sacrifice everything you have for a truth that is not even your own? It is a choice that reveals not what we want, but who we are. For Arthur, the entire 60 years of his life, the ghost of his father, the memory of his wife, the future of his daughter, all coalesced into this single, silent, terrible moment. He looked at Caldwell's face, a face twisted with the arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything. He saw not a neighbor, but a thief, a man whose prosperity was a monument to another's pain. He then turned and looked at Elara. She stood beside him, her expression unwavering, her presence a silent testament to her grandfather's stolen legacy. She did not nod or give him any sign. She simply trusted him. Finally, he looked down at the cracked, dry soil beneath his own worn boots. He had spent his life fighting for this land, believing it was his legacy, but he understood now. The land was not the legacy. The truth was. He lifted his head and looked Richard Caldwell squarely in the eye. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of a mountain. "You can't buy my silence," he said. "My father already sold his." The words were a pebble tossed into a still pond, and the ripples they created were a tidal wave. The act of defiance, so simple, so absolute, shattered the spell of fear that had held Blackwood Creek in its grip for 60 years. It was as if a great, invisible weight had been lifted from the shoulders of the entire community. For a moment, there was only a stunned silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a sound. A woman was weeping. It was Martha Slocum, a woman in her late 80s, her face a web of wrinkles. She took a single, shuffling step forward, her hand clutching the arm of her son. "I remember," she said, her voice thin but clear. "I remember the night the Martins left. My father said they were driven out. He said Mr. Caldwell's father threatened them. He told my father to keep his mouth shut if he wanted to keep his job at the grain elevator. The dam had broken. Another man, a farmer named George Peterson, whose land bordered the Caldwell Empire on the other side, stepped forward. My dad worked for the Caldwells back then," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He never talked about it much, but he always called this land the bad land. He said it was built on bad business. He told me to never, ever cross Richard's father. One by one, the whispers of the past, the secrets kept, out of fear and necessity, began to surface, spoken aloud for the first time in 2 generations. The town was finding its voice, and that voice was a chorus of condemnation aimed directly at the man who had long believed he was untouchable. The auction was forgotten. The scene descended into a controlled chaos of murmurs, accusations, and the raw, cathartic release of a long-buried truth. Richard Caldwell stood frozen, his face ashen. The power he had wielded his entire life, a power built on wealth and fear, was evaporating before his eyes. He looked at the faces in the crowd and saw not the deferential neighbors he knew, but a jury of his peers, their eyes filled with a judgment he could no longer escape. He turned without another word, pushed past his stunned lawyer and retreated to his truck, the jeers and accusations of the townspeople following him like stones. The legal battle that followed was, as Caldwell had promised, long and arduous. His corporate lawyers fought with every tool at their disposal, filing motions, casting doubt, and attempting to paint Arthur as an unstable, vengeful man. But the letter was a powerful anchor, and now it was supported by a flood of public testimony. The story became a statewide sensation, then a national one. The media descended on Blackwood Creek, and the name Caldwell became synonymous not with success, but with a 60-year-old crime. Federal investigators began to look into the family's business practices, uncovering a pattern of predatory loans and land acquisitions that went far beyond the Martin farm. The Caldwell Empire, built on a foundation of silence, began to crumble under the weight of the spoken truth. In the end, justice was served. A court awarded the Martin estate a landmark settlement, a sum that acknowledged the decades of stolen prosperity and restored their family's honor and wealth. Elara Martin, the public defender from Chicago, had not just won a case, she had reclaimed her family's history. The Caldwell name was permanently tarnished, a cautionary tale whispered across the state, and Arthur Jensen, the man who had started it all, lost his farm. It was sold as part of the complex legal fallout, a small, insignificant casualty in a much larger war. But as he packed the last of his belongings into a small moving truck, he felt not a sense of loss, but of a profound and staggering liberation. One afternoon, as he was making his final trip, a car he didn't recognize pulled up. The driveway. It was his daughter, Sarah. She stepped out of the car, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across the dusty yard. She had seen the news, had read the stories. The shame she had felt for her father, The man she saw as a stubborn failure had been replaced by a deep, aching pride she didn't know how to express. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry." He didn't need to ask what she was sorry for. He just walked to her and held her, and in that embrace the deepest wound of his life finally began to heal. She had come not to pity him, but to help him, to be with him, to bring him home. The story ends, but it does not end in that dusty farmhouse. It ends a year later on a green hill overlooking the valley. The land that had once belonged to the Caldwells was now a patchwork of smaller, independent farms, many of them run by a trust established by the Martin estate to help new farmers get their start. The valley was breathing. Again, Arthur stood on that hill, the wind no longer a mournful enemy but a gentle friend, ruffling his grey hair. He owned no land here. His home was a small apartment in a nearby town, close to Sarah and her new family. But his spirit resided here, in this valley he had helped to set free. Ilara stood beside him, no longer his lawyer but his friend. They looked out at the land, at the new life taking root in the soil. He had lost his farm, but he had found his daughter. He had lost his past, but he had found his soul. He had finally understood his father, not with anger but with a sad, forgiving grace, and he had given a voice to a family that had been silenced for generations. He had no farm, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly, completely, unshakably free. How many times does life put us in a cage of other people's expectations, of our own perceived failures, of a past we feel we cannot change? We live within those bars, accepting them as the boundaries of our world, forgetting that we hold the key. Arthur's story is a reminder that a legacy is not the land you own or the money you accumulate. It is not written in deeds or in bank statements. A true legacy is written in the choices you make when you are at your most broken. It is measured by the courage you show when you have nothing left to lose. It is the truth you are willing to speak, even if your voice shakes. So many injustices, large and small, thrive in silence. They fester in the quiet. Corners of families, of communities, of nations, perpetuated by the fear of speaking out. But every now and then, a single voice, a single act of defiance, can break the spell. It can let the light into a room that has been dark for generations. It proves that the end of one story, even a story of failure and loss, can be the beginning of justice for another. If this story spoke to you, if you have ever felt trapped by a past that was not your own, or if you have ever found the courage to speak a difficult truth, let us know in the comments. Write the words, "I too have experienced a turning point," because every life has a moment where the ground shifts, and we must choose whether to fall or to finally learn how to fly.